So thank you for letting me do some research on this. I've learned a lot and I have a lot to share with you. So basically, to start off, I'm sure you know what a carbon offset is, but just to clarify, a carbon offset is an intangible commodity that represents a specific reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. They're traded on the market, and one carbon offset is equal to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide in almost all organizations. So I just did a little bit of extra research on why it's important for CU to offset its flights or residents' life specifically. And I don't know if you might find this useful when and if you end up talking to people about this, but basically, you can see this graph of carbon dioxide levels over time. They're rising really fast. We're at about 415 right now, which is really scary. And so right now it's clear that fossil fuels currently power the globe. And despite a recent rise in renewables, the demand for coal, oil, and natural gas are still at an all-time high. And so is our atmosphere's carbon dioxide concentration. And so the IPCC says that we need to cut global emissions in half by 2030 in order to have at least a 50% chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius additional rise, which is the goal set by the Paris Climate Agreements. And so, and many climate scientists actually insist on zero emissions by 2050. So this is really critical that we take action on this right now in any way that we can, as fast as we can. So, and it's important to note, I'm sure you know as well, that carbon offsets aren't the answer to slowing down climate change. We can't just emit an offset and then everything's fine. Clearly we have to focus on reducing our emissions in the first place. But what offsets can do is they can buy us more time to decarbonize our world and our society. So they're just one tool out of many that we must deploy in order to have a chance at preventing some of the most terrifying impacts of climate change. And I think this is especially relevant for airplanes because we don't currently have a fossil fuel-free option for commercial air travel. I hope we do in the future, but airplanes seem like they'll be one of the last technologies in order to be powered by 100% electric. So this is a really great application of offsetting. And then lastly, sadly, in addition to being the world's largest per capita contributor of carbon emissions, the US also has flies far more people than in other countries, as you can see in this graph. So in my opinion, we kind of, as Americans, we kind of have even more of an obligation to take action regarding air travel, considering we do so much of it. So next I want to move on to the one major flaw of carbon offsets. They're amazing, but the flaw is that there is a lot of opportunity for fraud, meaning that if CU spends money on carbon offsets, that money might not actually translate into the amount of emissions reductions that we were promised by the organization. So it's really important to evaluate and monitor offset projects. And I did some research and found that there's an acronym called PAVR, which is an internationally recognized criteria for carbon offset projects. So let's go over what it means. So PAVR is permanent, additional, verified, enforceable, and real. So first of all, the permanency is a really important thing to consider because if we offset our emissions and reduce emissions, it's important that can't be reversed in the future. And there are some projects that are vulnerable to that. For example, there are a lot of projects where farmers are paid to store carbon in the soil through regenerative agriculture. And a lot of that happens in no-till agriculture. so where the soil is not being broken or disturbed. So that stores carbon in the soil, but then in the future, if a farmer converts back to conventional agriculture on that land, that carbon in the soil could be then released, undoing the whole benefit. So as much as possible, we should make sure that we're supporting offsets that are as permanent as possible. In addition, or additionality is another important concept that I learned through doing some research on carbon offsets. So it means that the carbon reduction would not have occurred without the offset happening. So there's an issue that could happen. For example, if let's say there's a forest management project that aims to keep this area of forest intact for future generations. But like, what if the owner of that land already like was planning on just keeping it intact? Then us paying to keep it intact isn't really adding any additional carbon reduction because it was going to happen anyways. So it's important that the reduction isn't going to happen unless we pay for this offset. Next, it's important that our offsets are verified by third-party auditing organizations to determine whether or not they actually occurred, how much carbon was actually reduced, and like, is the organization doing their due diligence? I'll talk about that more in the next slide. Next, enforceable, that kind of plays off the verification, meaning that if the organization that we're paying to reduce carbon like fails to really follow through on the project, or there's a failure and the project doesn't happen, like, is there a penalty for that? And then lastly, this is silly, but is the project real? Because apparently there have been a lot, like not a lot, but some projects where people and organizations are paying and then the project never happens at all. So that's like some serious fraud right there. Cool. So now talking about third-party auditing, there are 4 major organizations that certify carbon offsets: American Carbon Registry, Climate Action Reserve, Verified Carbon Standard, and Gold Standard. So according to an article I read, when purchasing offsets, universities in particular should look for offsets that are third-party verified. And that's because these offsets that have been verified will have undergone a robust verification process to ensure integrity and authenticity. And then lastly, these credits are also all tracked on registries to ensure that emissions reductions are not double counted. So so like CU isn't offsetting, and then another university isn't offsetting, and like we want to make sure those offsets are separate and it's not the same metric ton of carbon and we're paying twice. So now I'm going to move on to the types of carbon offset projects, and I'll try to be pretty brief. So the first type is investing in renewable energy development. These are sometimes called renewable energy credits. And that's self-explanatory. The next is there are projects that capture methane from landfills. And I think it's pretty common for projects like this to burn the methane to create carbon dioxide, because CO2 has less warming potential than methane does, which is interesting. And I think there are some that actually can capture it for fuel, like take the natural gas and then use it for fuel. There's also projects that gather manure from dairy farms and break it down using microbes and then use it as a biogas, similar to the other landfill project. There are some projects that they distribute clean cooking stoves and water filters to communities in need. And specifically, this reduces carbon by reducing the amount of deforestation that happens in order to provide wood for wood-burning stoves. And the water filters, a lot of people are cutting down forests in order to make a fire to boil their water so that they can make sure they have purified water. So the water filters prevents that from happening. which is cool. Also provides a positive health externality there. And then lastly, there are a lot of projects that protect forests. So they either buy large areas of forest or pay in order for that forest to be kind of monitored and protected or better managed to prevent it from being cut or burned down. All right, so I wanted to I'm basically going to talk about 6 different carbon offset programs that I like in particular, and this is the first. This one's called Native Energy, and I actually found it because it's the CU Environmental Center's offset partner. So the eCenter has a page on their website where they encourage people and departments to donate to Native Energy. I guess they have like a large account, and then the eCenter has a little form you can fill out. Maybe you've seen it. And so yeah, I looked into them a little bit more. And what's interesting is they have a bunch of different projects on their website, but how they do it is instead of spreading their funding across different projects, their strategy is that they choose one project at any given time. Like for 2019, it's providing clean water filters to people in Honduras. So they choose one project at a time. So like if you're buying offsets at one given time, it all goes to one organization, but they kind of switch it on you every year or two. And then, yeah, so when the project is then funded, then they move on. So there's also this, and I won't talk about it too in depth, but you can look back at the slide if you're interested later. But basically, they also offer a program for larger companies or organizations to kind of build their own or invest in an entirely new carbon offset project, and it's called Help Build. So that's a cool option as well. I don't think the Environmental Center is doing that. So yeah. Then another cool company that I really like is called POChamma, and all of their projects are focused specifically on forest management. And so like forest management can be tricky because of the difficulty in like monitoring it. But what I really like about POChamma is that they're pretty new, and they're the first platform to use a combination of LiDAR, satellite images, and artificial intelligence to measure the carbon captured by forests as a way to validate and monitor the claims of forest carbon projects. So they're using technology in order to ensure that the emissions that you're paying to protect or the carbon you're paying to keep alive in these forests is actually staying there. And I like how it's verified by the 4 carbon offset organizations. I think Native Energy is also verified by these organizations too. And I actually talked to someone from POChamma via email because you need an account in order to view their projects. So I got the account login info if you want to check it out. And they have projects in Brazil and in the US. Next, the third offset project is called Cool Effect. And I like Cool Effect because they're a nonprofit. They're the only nonprofit that I'm talking about in this PowerPoint. And they offer a wide variety of different projects at different price points. I like that every project is double certified by 2 of the auditing organizations, which is really cool. So they have a ton of diverse projects, like I said, ranging from methane capture to clean cook stoves, biogas projects, forest protection. So you can click that link to check out their different projects. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure you just choose one or many. So yeah, there's just a lot to choose from there. And they seem like a pretty credible organization. Next, I just want to introduce something. So when I was looking for offsets, I remember we talked about like wanting offsets that were more direct because like the water filter distribution is a little bit indirect, and it would be cool to be investing in offsets that were more directly reducing carbon. And so that's actually called carbon removal, and it's gained popularity in the last few years. And this video is produced by a carbon removal organization called Noorie. And I thought it was really helpful in just kind of understanding the difference between carbon offsets and carbon removal. So I'll just play it for you really quick.
Hi everyone, this is Alessandra from Noorie. So I wanted to address in this video a question that I get asked all the time, and it's a good one. It's what's the difference between Noorie's carbon removal certificates and regular offsets? Let's get into it. So if you look at the total amount of voluntary offsets sold, less than 5% actually represent carbon removal. That means that carbon was taken from the atmosphere and stored somewhere else. Most of them come from renewable energy, or RECs. Now let's look at this from an accounting standpoint. Say this is your x-axis and emissions and CO2. Say I want to fly from New York to Miami, and that means I emit X tons of CO2. Well, if I buy a renewable energy offset, that just means that someone else didn't have to have carbon emissions associated with the use of that clean energy, like solar or wind. Great idea, because now instead of having 2x, you actually have 1x emitted, right? That's a little sloppy. So then the next one is energy efficiency. What does that look like? What is an energy efficiency offset? Well, it's really just the difference of how much you would have emitted before, this tall one. With your new upgrades, you're emitting less CO2 because you're more efficient with your energy. This delta is the amount saved. So now you're at 1.5x. I want to make this nicer because it illustrates the point well. 1.5x of my emissions that I would have for flying. Then another one that's most common is RED+. If you're curious about these numbers, you can go to the Forest Trends 2017 report. So RED are avoiding deforestation, protecting your forest. Super important, because we need to protect our forests and our lands so that they don't continue to emit and so that they can continue to build ecological diversity. And so if I buy a RED offset, that means that I've paid someone who owns land with forest in it not to tear that forest down. Great work. But in the end, I also still emitted on my flight my X tons, but I paid someone else not to emit. Very similar to this one. In the end, I still emitted X tons of CO2. Now, let's look at something like a forestry or regenerative agriculture, where Noorie's getting a lot of their carbon removal certificates from. That's this 5% that represents carbon removal. If I am, now I'm running out of room here, but I still emitted 1 ton for my flight, but then I pay for carbon removal to take that CO2 from the atmosphere and store it back into the land or in some industrial process. And that is the negative here. So it's pretty simple math. I've emitted a ton by flying, or whatever amount, and then I've removed by buying a Noorie carbon removal certificate. That gets me to 0 emissions. The rest get me to maybe 1, someone else didn't emit, half because we emitted less, 1 because I paid for someone else not to emit. We call those avoidances. That's over 90%, or 95% of offsets sold in voluntary registries that represent avoidances of CO2 emissions. Carbon removal is less than 5%, and Noorie focuses exclusively on making sure that we can do this negating of emissions. So that's why we say buy a carbon removal certificate to negate your emissions, not necessarily offset. That's the difference. Stay tuned for more information later. Thank you.
Cool. So, back to this. Let me see. All right. So I really like the idea of carbon removal. And so here are the different carbon removal types of projects I found. So the first one, like what Noorie does, is regenerative agriculture. So I've been hearing a lot about that lately, that our soils have an enormous capacity to absorb carbon if we use the right agricultural techniques, including rotational grazing with livestock, no-till agriculture using cover crops, adding organic matter to the soil, etc. In addition, afforestation is basically tree planting. So if we plant trees that didn't exist before, those are absorbing carbon directly. In addition, I really love direct air capture. So that's basically humans have designed machines which capture carbon dioxide from the air and then permanently store it underground. Sometimes some of these companies are also taking that CO2 and then using it to create like carbon neutral fuel, which is cool too. And then lastly, there's something called enhanced weathering. I don't know of any organizations that are doing this right now in terms of like a carbon removal credit, but distributing crushed silicate rocks on soil surfaces to absorb and bind carbon dioxide chemically. That's a super new technology. So, I'm going to talk a little bit more about afforestation. Like, I love the idea of tree planting, though that's the type of carbon offsetting I've done in the past personally. And I love that there are so many positive externalities relating to rewilding our earth, increasing habitat, biodiversity, ecosystem services, investing in a green future. Currently, humans have destroyed half of all the world's forests, so I think this is a really great idea. There are some drawbacks. The main problem is that it takes trees a long time to grow. So you're funding the planting of the trees, but there might be a 10, 20 year gap before the trees are really absorbing as much carbon as we need them to absorb. Also, there's an issue of permanency because it's possible that the trees could be cut down in the future, or they could die during a forest fire. And then your carbon is all of a sudden back in the atmosphere. And then lastly, there's some issues with the difficulty and expense of really measuring how much carbon you're absorbing, because you need to send teams out into the field to measure the diameter of each tree, or just rely on modeling, which might not be accurate. I did find a cool company called Wren they have one afforestation project and 2 other projects, which I really thought that their projects were cool, and I liked their method. And basically, their tree planting project, they pay farmers in East Africa to plant trees and then maintain them. And what I like about this project is that the organization that they partner with has a track record of success of planting 18 million trees over 20 years, and almost all of those trees are still thriving. So that seemed pretty convincing to me. The other projects they have are cool too. They have a project that provides clean cooking fuel to refugees in Uganda. And what I like about this one specifically is that Wren actually buys agricultural waste products from local farmers in Uganda, and then they manufacture these clean cooking bricks that are used as cooking fuel out of these waste products, and then distribute them to refugees. And their goal is that every person in that area or in that camp will have clean cooking fuel. The issue is I don't know how long they're going to be giving this cooking fuel to the refugees, but it seems really important, preventing deforestation. And then they also have a project where they provide deforestation monitoring technology to indigenous communities in Peru so that people can monitor deforestation using drones, using satellite technology. So that was pretty innovative and cool. You can check out the projects on the website. So then I'm going to talk about regenerative agriculture a little bit more. I guess I already went over it, but basically using no-till farming, cover crops, rotational grazing, applying organic matter, and using agroforestry and polycropping systems in order to store carbon in the soil, keep carbon in the soil. The pros is that it has a ton of positive externalities, including restoring soil health, which is really critical right now, reducing water pollution, reducing runoff, reduced chemicals, I think. And then, but some of the cons of it are that there's also an issue of permanency, meaning the carbon could be released if the soil is tilled in the future. So that carbon could be released. In addition, it's difficult to know how much carbon a given soil can sequester because soils are so diverse and different. So it's hard to predict how much carbon like a regenerative agriculture project is going to absorb and how long it'll take. And it might take a few years or a decade for soils to absorb their maximum carbon capacity. Noorie is a really cool, innovative startup that is basically working with farmers to monitor how much carbon they're capturing in the soil. And then they recently launched a marketplace selling carbon removal credits, which will provide financial incentive for farmers to begin farming regeneratively or continue farming regeneratively because it does cost more than conventional agriculture. And right now, I think they've just launched on a single farm, so it's super new, but they're going to be adding more farms in the coming months. They don't have any third-party verifications yet, but I think it's because they're very new. Also, maybe it's because these farms are so small. I'm not exactly sure. But now I'm going to talk about direct air capture, which is the machines that suck carbon. The pros of this is that carbon is permanently and immediately removed from the atmosphere. It's also really easy to know exactly how much carbon you're removing with this technology and exactly when it was removed. And so it's just easy to monitor compared to all the other options. And it has the potential to make a huge impact. If we can scale these machines and get them all across the globe, we could really make a huge difference in terms of reaching the goal of 1.5 degrees warming. But the cons are that it's really expensive because it's brand new technology. It costs a lot more to reduce carbon with direct air capture than all the other methods. I guess it also requires like the construction of giant machinery, which has embodied emissions and high embodied energy. But I think it's really amazing. Here's a really cool company called Clym Works that has built 3 geothermally powered direct air capture plants in Iceland. And they just started offering carbon offsets. So they directly remove carbon dioxide from the air and capture it in a gas form. They're currently selling some of this carbon dioxide or all of it as fuel. But, one of their facilities, they're injecting it into the ground and permanently storing it in the form of stone. So I think that's their long-term plan, is to have all of their facilities turning the carbon into permanent rock. And they have ambitious plans to scale all across the globe. Here's 2 diagrams, one showing the carbon to rock on the left, and then on the right showing the carbon to fuel process. And this is a really awesome organization, and the only drawback is that it's just very expensive, a lot more expensive than the other options. But this would be a really awesome, innovative new way to carbon offset, or I guess to remove carbon. As you can see, the cost of Clym Works to reduce 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide is almost $1,100 compared to all the other options, which are very reasonably priced. So I don't know if it's probably not necessarily feasible, but I wanted to include it on here. So these are the 6 that I personally thought were really good options for carbon offsets. So here's the price breakdown of each of them, and then I also have a spreadsheet that goes into more details comparing all of these different options. Thanks so much for watching.